Francis Fukuyama es uno de los intelectuales públicos más reconocidos, no solamente de Estados Unidos, su país, sino de todo el mundo. Yo su primer ensayo de él lo leí en los años 90 y fue un ensayo que dejó una huella muy profunda en la comprensión de la transición política que estaba teniendo lugar en Europa Oriental. El libro se llamaba El fin de la historia y el último hombre. Ha venido publicando una serie de libros desde entonces, libros que nos explican la realidad política, las realidades económicas, y acaba de publicar un libro que terminé de leer en estos días, que es un libro que me parece importante, todavía no está en español. En inglés se llama Liberalism and its Discontents, el liberalismo y sus malestares. Yo quiero agradecer al profesor Fukuyama esta entrevista y vamos a hacer la conversación en inglés para que usted directamente pueda escuchar sus palabras. Professor Fukuyama, thank you very much for this conversation. You talk about liberalism, and one of the first things you say in your book is that we have to understand what liberalism is, because the word has been used with different meanings throughout the years, but especially right now it is used in very different ways. It's even used differently in the United Kingdom and or in Europe and in the United States. What kind of liberalism are you referring to in your book?
Sure. So liberalism for me is a doctrine that tries to lower the sights of politics. It says that we're not going to agree on the most important things as defined, let's say, by religion. We're going to let people follow their own choices with regard to what they believe and protect their autonomy, because one of the most fundamental things that makes a human being is their capacity for moral choice. And so a liberal society believes that all human beings have the same rights to that kind of basic freedom, and that freedom needs to be protected by a rule of law that limits the power of the state, the government, to interfere in those basic choices that people make.
It wasn't always like that. For a long time, for centuries, for a millennia, it was the state that decided what the individual could think or could believe in, isn't it?
Well, it's still the case. I mean, if you go to Russia and China, you criticize the government or you express a thought that isn't approved, you're going to be sent to jail. So it's not as if that practice has stopped, but I think that freedom of speech has always been one of the fundamental freedoms that liberal societies have tried to protect, because they believe that nobody has a monopoly on the truth, least of all the state. And if people can't discuss and debate freely, you're not actually ever going to get closer to the truth.
You make a distinction as well between liberalism and neoliberalism. What is the difference?
Well, neoliberalism has a very negative connotation here in Latin America.
It's almost pejorative, yeah. Mm-hmm.
In my view, neoliberalism isn't the same as capitalism. It's a kind of extension of liberal economic principles that took place in the 1980s and 1990s. It was associated with the University of Chicago and
the Milton Friedman theory.
Economists, like Milton Friedman, that basically saw markets as the solution to most human problems.
But when you talk about liberalism and why we have to defend liberalism, you also quote Deirdre McCloskey, who was also professor at the University of Chicago, a woman, originally a man, who was actually promoted the need to maintain freedom, economic freedom, also personal freedom, and who believes that liberalism, in fact, she has a book on why liberalism works. And she believes that it's absolutely essential for economic progress, but also for individual dignity.
Well, that's true. I think that one of the rights that liberalism protects is the right to own private property. Mm-hmm. That's part of the reason that liberalism is closely associated with market economies and therefore with a lot of economic growth. But if you ask yourself, why do people want freedom? Part of it is really, so that they can engage in the kinds of economic activities that they find satisfying and beneficial to themselves and their families. And I think that, many people actually find the fullest satisfaction in what they do in life to earn a salary. And so that freedom is, I think, a basic one that is an important aspect of human dignity.
In the end of history, you were confronted with the with the collapse of the socialist regimes, the socialist governments of Eastern Europe, and you said, okay, this is really something very deep. We're really looking at, this could even be the end of history in the sense that maybe the whole of humanity will accept democratic liberalism as the right way to live. Have you changed your mind after everything that's happened since the 1989 collapse of the Berlin Wall or the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, we had a change in the world situation. So in 1989 or 91, we were midway through what's been called the third wave of democratizations, where the number of democracies expanded from maybe 35 to over 100. But over the last 15, 16 years, we've been in a reverse move where the number has fallen, and it's also, liberalism has been challenged in countries that were originally very big, important liberal states like India, like the United States. So clearly we're in a very different sort of world where the trends are going towards authoritarianism. The argument that I was making back then, however, wasn't a prediction that everybody would become a liberal society.
And you've actually said it many times. Okay, I wasn't making a prediction.
Yeah, I wasn't making a prediction. I was saying that there didn't seem to be a real alternative, that was higher than liberalism, that would eventually replace liberalism, which is exactly the argument that the Marxists made. They also believed in the end of history, but for them, the end of history would be a communist utopia. And it seemed to me that that simply wasn't going to materialize, and the closest you were going to get to a good society was, this combination of freedom and equality that's embodied in a liberal democracy.
Many countries, especially in Latin America, have always looked at the United States as the paradigm of liberalism and democracy. And then we saw Donald Trump in the presidency, and in fact, tremendous reluctance on his part to accept a democratic process, which he lost clearly, at least in my opinion. What does that mean historically, and what does it mean that we can see someone like Donald Trump emerge in the United States and be elected president through a democratic process, and then even try to resist the democratic process that actually kicked him out of office?
Well, that's been one of the most disappointing things about the United States in my experience, that many people were willing to vote for a man that, in my view, was completely, it wasn't just that he was unqualified to be president. He had negative characteristics that would make him like one of the worst presidents ever. Dishonest, short attention span, not really serious about anything other than his own personal short-term interests. And you're right, I think we're in a very serious situation in the United States, because he's managed to convince maybe a third of Americans that the last election that elected Joe Biden was stolen. And,
which is clearly not true, but it's amazing how many people are actually accepting that. We're seeing a polarization in the United States and in other countries. It's not only the U.S., it's happening in Mexico, it's happening in continental Europe or in the United Kingdom. Is this polarization a danger, a threat to the democratic liberal status quo that we've had for many?
Well, when polarization gets past a certain point, yes, it is definitely a threat. I think that, democratic systems don't agree on things, and so you actually need alternative points of view, and they have to argue with each other, before you get to an agreed policy. But in the United States, the polarization has been so severe that it's basically politicized, almost every aspect of decision making, and it becomes this big power contest where you're not actually thinking about what's the best thing for the country as a whole, what's best for my party, winning the next election, and being able to then dominate. And that, is not, I think, the appropriate way to think about democratic contestation. You do need to think about public interest and the broader interest of the country as a whole.
It's clear to me that democracy and liberalism have discontents, as you put it in your book. But do you think it's still a feasible system? Do you think that democratic liberalism can continue to be adopted by countries? And does it work? Does it make people's lives better?
Well, certainly the historical record is great. Well. It's a way of governing over diversity, and that was the way that the European wars of religion were moderated in the 17th century. It's the way that the nationalist wars of the 20th century came to an end and were replaced by liberal institutions like the European Union that in many ways have been spectacularly successful, not just in bringing about peace, but in bringing about a prolonged period of economic growth. If we didn't have a kind of liberal trading system, China, India, the rest of the developed world would never have grown the way that they have. But also people in developed countries have prospered as well. The trouble is that that system doesn't make everybody a winner. Mm-hmm. And I think that...
but is there any system that can make everyone a winner?
Well, no, but what you want to do is provide the kind of social protections that moderate the effects of market competition.
Liberalismo with a social net?
I think that, the actual winning formula was the one that most developed democracies had after World War II, which was some form of social democracy in which you have government programs that provide social security, basic health care, unemployment insurance, that soften the effects of market competition. And that is what really produced the buy-in from the working class because, they were not maybe getting as rich as other people, the managers and the capitalists, but they were still seeing an improvement in their material conditions, and they were getting benefits and protections against, the kinds of real inequalities that a market economy by itself can produce.
We have a new challenge. It's China. We've seen China grow tremendously since the 1980s. And in fact, it became more liberal, and now it's becoming more authoritarian. What are the lessons that we should learn, or what's going to happen with China and with its relationship with the United States and the world?
Well, I wish I knew.
Oh, okay.
I wish I knew. I would say that since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, politically it's been going in the wrong direction towards more dictatorship, more centralization of control, less institutions. They used to turn over their entire leadership every 10 years, and now Xi Jinping says, I'm going to stay on for another 5 at least, and all of these things.
Forever.
Perhaps forever. And these are not good developments. I think that they're going to pay a price for this because they are increasingly abandoning the collective leadership that they had since 1978 in favor of one man's, will. And you're already seeing the effects of this in their approach to the COVID pandemic, where they pursued this, what I regard as a kind of crazy zero COVID strategy.
It's impossible. There's no pandemic that has been stopped cold the way they wanted.
Well, I mean, you can by stopping everything else.
Yeah, well, I guess so.
And that's what they're doing, in effect. And it's going to have a major impact on their economy, on people's personal freedom, just their ability to move, out of their apartment buildings and go shopping, this sort of thing. So they're paying a big price for this decision-making system that has become, really the province of one individual. And I think that's going to be a weakness going forward. Whether that's going to actually have a material impact on the regime is a different question, and I suspect not for a long time. And as long as you continue down this road, I do think that U.S.-China, Chinese-European relations are going to deteriorate.
I'm well aware, Professor Fukuyama, that liberalism has its discontents. I mean, you actually use a quote originally from Sigmund Freud. But my question now is, in spite of these discontents, do you still consider yourself a liberal?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, defined as I define it, right? In the United States, liberalism has a different meaning.
It's become left of sort center, of like state control of the economy or high taxation.
And that's not my definition. If you take my
classical
definition,
liberal.
A classical liberal, yes, I'm proud to be a classical liberal.
Professor Francis Fukuyama, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much for talking to me.
Gracias. Y a usted, amigo, que al vernos y escucharnos hace posible este programa, se lo agradezco también. Esto es todo por hoy, pero no se le olvide. Nos vemos la próxima.